Welcome back. Get comfortable, because tonight we are going somewhere that is going to take a while to fully explore, and that is exactly the point. Tonight we are going to untangle something that has been quietly confusing people for the better part of 15 years, and that thing is the timeline of the Walking Dead universe. Now, if you are already a fan of the show, or even just a casual viewer who dipped in and out over the years, you already know that this is not a simple thing to explain. You try to tell someone where to start and you immediately run into problems. Do you start with the original show? Do you tell them about Fear the Walking Dead, which starts before the original show, but then catches up to it and then overtakes it? Do you mention World Beyond, which is set a full decade after the outbreak and deals with an entirely different part of the country? What about Daryl Dixon, which for reasons the show has not fully explained yet, takes place in France? And The Ones Who Live, which is the show that finally, after 5 years of waiting, tells us what happened to Rick Grimes after he disappeared on that bridge in Georgia. The answer to where someone should start is genuinely complicated, and the answer to how all of these shows fit together on a single timeline is something that even dedicated fans have argued about at length in forums and comment sections and late-night conversations that probably went longer than anyone intended. So that is what we are doing tonight. We are going through the whole thing, from the very first days of the outbreak, through the years of rebuilding and collapse and rebuilding again, all the way to Manhattan and France and Philadelphia and wherever the story is still going. We are going to do it in order, the way it actually happened inside the world of the show, not the order in which these things were released, because release order will make your head spin. This is a long one. That is also the point. If you are listening to this as you drift off, I want the story to be long enough to carry you all the way there. And if you are listening and still awake by the end, well then hopefully you found the whole thing interesting enough to be glad you stayed. Either way, you are in good hands. Let us start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the show, but the beginning of the world inside the show, back before everything fell apart. The world of The Walking Dead did not end on a specific date that the show ever confirmed. This was a deliberate choice by the writers, and honestly, it was a smart one. Tying the outbreak to a real calendar year would have dated the story, would have invited comparisons to real-world events, and would have made continuity harder to manage across a franchise that would eventually span more than 15 years of production. So the show kept things deliberately vague when it came to the actual calendar. What we do know is this. Somewhere in the recent past, relative to when the show began airing in 2010, something happened. The cause is never fully explained in the original show, though it is hinted at in various ways. What matters is the effect. A pathogen or a mutation or something that the scientists at the CDC in Atlanta were not able to identify or stop in time began causing the recently deceased to reanimate. Not in the dramatic, movie monster way of something being injected or bitten initially, though bites do come to matter enormously. The reanimation was happening on its own, to anyone who died from any cause. The bite from a walker accelerates the process, makes the fever burn faster, makes the death come sooner, but the reanimation itself is not caused by the bite. Everyone already carries whatever this is. Everyone who dies will come back, unless their brain is destroyed. This is information the audience gets slowly, in pieces. It is one of the show's most important reveals, and we will come back to it. But for now, understand that when the world ended, it ended for everyone simultaneously, in the sense that no one was safe, even if they never encountered a walker directly. You could die of a heart attack in a locked room and still come back. The military response, at least in the United States, was what you might expect, and also much worse than you would hope. Cities were bombed, not to stop the outbreak, but to try to contain it, which of course did not work because the infection was not localized. There are references throughout the franchise to military helicopters, to destroyed bridges, to entire urban populations that were cordoned off and then abandoned. The government tried to fight something that could not be fought with conventional force, and it failed. And then the government itself ceased to exist, at least in any form that the surviving population could access or depend on. By the time Rick Grimes opens his eyes in a hospital bed in King County, Georgia, the world has already been gone for some time. How long exactly? This is one of the more contested questions in Walking Dead lore. Based on the state of the hospital when Rick wakes up, based on the decay of the bodies he encounters, based on various context clues that the production design embedded into the early episodes, most fans and analysts have concluded that Rick has been unconscious for somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks. The hospital has been evacuated. Flowers left at his bedside have long since died and dried. The hallways are dark. The power long since cut. He wakes up alone in a room that has been barricaded from the outside. Not locked, barricaded, as though someone was trying to keep something out, rather than keep Rick in. He finds a nurse's call button that no longer works. He finds his IV line dry and empty. He finds his legs weak from weeks of disuse. He finds his water gone and his thirst desperate. And when he opens the door to his room, he finds the beginning of everything. The hospital corridor is dark. Gurneys line the walls. There are shapes on the floor that he does not look at too closely. At the end of the hallway is a set of double doors with chains wrapped around the handles, and through the small gap where the doors meet, hands are reaching. Just hands, dozens of them, pale and slow, pressing through the gap. Rick does not know what they are yet. He finds a stairwell instead. The stairwell smells of rot so thick it is almost physical. He lights matches to find his way down. At the bottom, a heavy door opens onto the back of the hospital, a loading bay in full daylight, and what he sees there is hundreds of bodies wrapped in sheets, arranged in rows, already gone. He walks out into a Georgia morning that is completely silent, except for the wind and the distant sound of something he cannot yet name. This is where The Walking Dead begins, in terms of Rick's story. But here is where the timeline starts to get interesting, because Rick's story is not the only story that was happening. On the other side of the country, in Los Angeles, California, a high school English teacher named Travis Manawa was having a completely ordinary week. His son was struggling with drug addiction. His girlfriend Madison Clark was worried about one of her students, a quiet boy named Nick, who had gone missing and turned up raving about dead people in an abandoned church. The news was reporting on isolated incidents of violence. Social media was full of shaky phone footage that could have been anything. This is Fear the Walking Dead, and it begins in the days immediately before and then during the collapse. Its first season overlaps almost exactly with the period when Rick was unconscious. While Rick was in his hospital bed, unknown and unreachable, the world that would become his was being lost in real time, around people who did not yet understand what was happening. Fear the Walking Dead is, in many ways, the show that The Walking Dead could never quite be, because it arrived after the premise was already established. The original show had the luxury of beginning in media res, of dropping Rick into a world the audience already knew was broken. Fear had to show the breaking. It had to depict the moment when a nurse's strange behaviour became something more, when a police shooting of a stumbling figure on the freeway became a news story, when the news story became a pattern, when the pattern became a catastrophe. The Clark family, Travis and Madison and their children, Nick and Alicia, lived through those first weeks in a way that feels genuinely disorienting. The power goes out neighbourhood by neighbourhood. The National Guard moves into their street in the middle of the night and sets up checkpoints. Neighbours begin to disappear. The children ask questions that the adults cannot answer because the adults do not know the answers yet. There is a scene in Fear the Walking Dead's first season where a neighbourhood barbecue turns into a nightmare in the span of about 30 seconds. And the speed of it, the absolute absence of warning is one of the most effective pieces of apocalyptic television I have come across. One moment people are standing around with drinks in their hands, and then someone falls, and then the falling person gets up in a way that is not right, and then the screaming starts, and then the barbecue is over, and so is everything else. The National Guard, in Fear's version of early Los Angeles, sets up a safe zone around the neighborhood. They bring food, they enforce a curfew, they are polite about it, mostly. And then gradually, people start noticing that the National Guard is not bringing anyone back from the medical facility they have set up down the street. No one comes home from the medical facility. And when someone finally gets close enough to see, what they find is not a hospital. Fear the Walking Dead's first 2 seasons are the story of the Clark family and their immediate circle trying to survive that collapse. First in Los Angeles, then on a boat off the coast of Baja California, then in Mexico itself, where they encounter a surviving community in a hotel, and then a ranch, and then further and further south as the original community of survivors fractures and reforms and fractures again. All of this is happening in the same time period as the first 2 seasons of the original Walking Dead. Rick is walking out of his hospital. He's finding his family at a campsite outside Atlanta. He's making his first attempts to build something that will hold. And on the other side of the continent, Travis and Madison are on a yacht, trying to figure out where in the world is still safe. They never intersect. For the first few seasons of both shows, there is a strict geographic separation. This is both a narrative choice and a practical one. The 2 shows share a world, but not a story, at least not yet. We will come back to Fear the Walking Dead, because it does eventually move geographically and thematically much closer to the original show's territory. But for now, let us stay with Rick, because his first year is the foundation that everything else in this universe is built on. Rick's first real destination after leaving the hospital is his home. His house is empty. His wife Laurie and his son Carl are gone. He does not know if they are alive. He does not know if they are dead and in the other state, the reanimated state. He finds a neighbour, a man named Morgan Jones, who has barricaded himself inside a house with his young son Dwayne. Morgan ties Rick to a bed when he first finds him, which seems extreme but is actually quite reasonable given the circumstances. He tells Rick, in quiet and careful terms, what the world is now. He tells him about the reanimation. He tells him that you have to destroy the brain. He tells him that you cannot hesitate. Morgan is, arguably, one of the most important characters in the entire Walking Dead franchise, not because of the screen time he gets in these early episodes, which is limited, but because of what he represents. He is the ordinary man who has been surviving on his own, without the protection of any group, without any external framework of rules or community, purely by his own careful and exhausted vigilance. He is also a man who cannot bring himself to do the one thing he knows he needs to do, which is end his wife, who was bitten and died and is now walking the street below the house, still coming to the front door in the evenings, the way she used to. Morgan's wife does not go away. She comes back to the house with what might be muscle memory, or might be something else, something the show carefully never defines. She tries the door handle. She stands on the lawn. Morgan watches her from behind a covered window with a rifle and cannot pull the trigger. This paralysis is the first articulation of something the show will return to again and again over 11 seasons and multiple spin-offs. The question of what the people you loved are after they are gone, whether there is anything left of them in those bodies, whether ending them is mercy or murder or simply necessity, whether you can afford, emotionally and practically, to keep asking the question. Rick leaves Morgan and Dwayne with supplies and a police radio and heads south toward Atlanta, where he believes his family may have gone based on what Morgan tells him about survivor groups and government centers. He rides into Atlanta on a horse, which is the kind of detail that should read as ridiculous but somehow does not. Because by the time he does it, the show has so fully established the texture of its broken world that a man on a horse in the ruins of a major American city feels inevitable rather than absurd. Atlanta is overrun. Rick is nearly killed on his first day in the city. He's saved by a young man named Glenn Rhee, who is making supply runs into the abandoned streets of the city with a small group of survivors who are camped outside the city limits. Glenn is quick and clever and has an extraordinary sense of the city's layout, having delivered pizzas there before the world ended. He is also, in these early episodes, one of the most purely likable characters on television, which is information the show is going to use in a very specific and devastating way several years down the line. The group outside Atlanta is where Rick finds Laurie and Carl alive, which is both a relief and immediately complicated. Laurie has been told, incorrectly, that Rick did not make it out of the hospital. She's been leaning on Rick's partner and best friend Shane Walsh for support, and that support has become something more than friendship in the weeks since the world ended. When Rick appears at the camp, Laurie is overjoyed and devastated simultaneously, and Shane's reaction to Rick's return is something that takes the show several more seasons to fully play out. Shane Walsh is one of the more interesting character studies the original show produced in its early run. He is not a villain in the traditional sense, at least not initially. He is a man who made decisions under pressure, who acted on the information he had, who convinced himself that what he was doing was right because the alternative was to admit that it was not. He genuinely believes, at least at first, that Rick being gone meant that he had an obligation to protect Laurie and Carl, and that this obligation included feelings he had carried for a long time before the world ended. When Rick comes back, Shane does not stop believing this. He just has to hide it, and hiding it makes him harder and more dangerous in ways that become impossible to contain. The camp outside Atlanta is destroyed in an attack one night. Several people die. The group decides to head to the Centers for Disease Control headquarters in Atlanta, on the theory that if anyone has found an answer, it would be there. What they find at the CDC is a single surviving scientist named Edwin Jenner, who has been working alone in an automated facility trying to understand the pathogen. He has not found an answer. He has, in fact, given up. And his plan for when the group arrives is to seal the building and let its automated countdown destroy everything, including himself and everyone inside. Jenner tells Rick something in a whispered exchange that the audience does not hear. This secret becomes one of the show's longest-running delayed reveals. What he tells Rick is that everyone is already infected. Everyone carries the pathogen. Everyone who dies will reanimate, regardless of whether they were ever bitten. Bite wounds are dangerous because the bacteria in a walker's mouth creates a secondary infection that kills quickly, but the reanimation itself is not exclusive to bite victims. It is universal. Rick does not tell the group this immediately. He carries it for a long time. When it finally comes out, it changes the texture of almost every conversation about death and survival that the show has had up to that point. And it means, in retrospect, that every single person who has died on screen was already carrying their own ending inside them from the very first episode. The group escapes the CDC before it explodes. They lose members. They keep moving. They are heading to Fort Benning, which they believe may be a functioning military installation, when their vehicles break down on a highway outside Atlanta. While they are clearing abandoned cars for supplies, a young boy named Sophia wanders off into the woods to hide from walkers and does not come back. The search for Sophia becomes the central thread of the show's second season, and it becomes, deliberately, something that some viewers found frustrating in the way that genuine loss is frustrating. The group is stuck. They are not moving towards safety. They are walking the same roads and fields, looking for a child who may or may not still be alive. They take shelter at a farm owned by a veterinarian named Herschel Green, who's been keeping a group of walkers in his barn because some of them were his family and neighbours, and he cannot accept what they are now. Herschel Green is, alongside Rick, one of the most important characters in the original show's run. He begins as an obstacle, someone who does not want this group of strangers on his land, who has a philosophy of survival that Rick's group considers dangerously naive, and who is eventually confronted with the truth about what the walkers are when the barn is opened and everyone inside is put down. He becomes, over time, the group's conscience. He is a man of deep religious faith who finds a way to hold that faith alongside the reality of the world he is living in, which is not a small thing. The search for Sophia ends in the mid-season finale of Season 2 in a way that the show had been building toward, and that still lands with full force even knowing it is coming. The barn is opened, the walkers inside are destroyed one by one, and then from the back of the barn, the last one walks out. It is Sophia. She has been in the barn the whole time. She has been dead the whole time. She is wearing the same clothes she disappeared in. Rick is the one who ends it. He has to be. Shane cannot do it. Herschel cannot. Daryl, who has been the most tireless searcher and who has formed a connection with Sophia's mother Carol that will define both their characters for the rest of the franchise, looks away. Rick does what needs to be done. That moment is, in many ways, the show's thesis statement about what survival costs. Not in the abstract, not philosophically, but in the specific and irreversible sense. The search was real. The hope was real. The ending was not what anyone wanted, and it happened anyway, and now they have to keep going. The group stays at the farm through the winter. Rick and Laurie's marriage is strained by the knowledge of what happened with Shane, and then further strained when Laurie discovers she is pregnant. The question of whether to continue the pregnancy in a world where childbirth carries enormous risk, and where any child born will grow up in conditions of constant danger, is not treated lightly by the show. Laurie is not sure she wants the child to survive into this world. Rick is not sure what to think. The conversation they have about it is one of the show's quietest and most human scenes. Shane's instability accelerates. He becomes more and more convinced that Rick's approach to leadership, his insistence on preserving the group's humanity, even when it costs them tactically, is going to get everyone killed. Shane is not entirely wrong about the tactical assessments. He is deeply wrong about the conclusions he draws from them. The confrontation between Rick and Shane in a field at night is the season's turning point, and it ends the way it has to end, with Rick making a choice that marks him permanently. After Shane's death, the farm is overrun. The group fragments on the road. They come back together in ones and twos over the following weeks, and when they reunite, they find a prison. The prison is the third act of the show's early period, and the setting that most fully articulates what the series is trying to say about civilization and its discontents. The group clears the prison yard, then a cell block, then more of the building, establishing a perimeter and a routine. They plant crops, they create a schedule, they give each other chores and roles, they try to build something. Running parallel to this, in a town called Woodbury, about 15 miles from the prison, a man who calls himself the governor is running his own version of civilization. Philip Blake, the governor's real name, arrived at Woodbury early in the outbreak and took control gradually, then completely. He maintains order through a combination of genuine provision. His people have electricity and food and relative safety and absolute authority. Anyone who challenges him disappears. Anyone who threatens the community from outside is eliminated. The governor has a room in his apartment that tells you everything you need to know about the state of his mind. It is a room full of aquariums, and in the aquariums, arranged on shelves, are the severed heads of walkers and of people he has had killed. He sits in this room in the evenings. He looks at the heads. He keeps one of them, the head of a National Guardsman whose helicopter he shot down near Woodbury, in a special place. He talks to it sometimes. The governor also has a daughter, or rather, he has what used to be his daughter, who is now a walker in a child's dress that he keeps in his apartment and feeds and calls by her name and refuses to put down. The humanity of this, the grief underneath the horror, is what makes the governor one of the more complicated antagonists the show produced. He is not a cartoon. He is a man who lost his mind in a specific and traceable way and built a society around his madness. Andrea, a member of Rick's group, who was separated during the farm's fall, finds her way to Woodbury and does not immediately see through the governor's performance. This failure of perception costs her enormously. It costs the group enormously. The season-long dance between the prison and Woodbury, the negotiations that fail, the attacks that escalate, ends in a first assault on the prison that the group repels, followed by the governor's own people turning on him in disgust, followed by his apparent death, followed by his return in the second half of Season 4, more unhinged and more dangerous than before. The second confrontation between the prison group and the governor ends with the prison itself destroyed. A tank driven by one of the governor's men tears holes in the walls. Walkers flood the yard. Herschel is killed, beheaded with Michonne's sword, in front of Rick and Maggie and Beth in a moment of pure brutality that the show had been building toward all season. The governor and Rick fight hand to hand in the yard until Michonne runs the governor through and leaves him to die. Laurie's baby, born during the chaos of the prison's early days, has grown into a toddler named Judith, and when Rick and Carl flee the falling prison, they find her bloody carrier on the ground and believe she is dead. She is not dead, but they do not know that yet. The fall of the prison is, in timeline terms, roughly 1.5 to 2 years after the outbreak began. The group has been surviving long enough to have a functioning community. Long enough for children to have been born and toddlers to have grown. Long enough for the weight of everything they have lost to be a physical thing they carry with them. After the prison falls, the group fragments completely. They scatter in small clusters across the rural Georgia landscape, and the mid-season break of Season 4 follows these fragments in turn. Rick and Carl together, barely. Michonne alone with her sword and her grief. Daryl and Beth. Maggie and Glenn apart from each other with separate groups of strangers. Tyrese and Sasha with baby Judith, who is very much alive. And following signs on the road, signs pointing toward a place called Terminus that promises sanctuary for all who arrive. Terminus is not sanctuary. What Terminus is a community of people who encountered something so terrible in the early days of the outbreak that it fundamentally broke them, and who rebuilt themselves around a philosophy of preying on travellers rather than being preyed upon. The Terminus residents are cannibals. They built their trap with the most appealing bait available, the idea of safety. Rick figures it out shortly after arrival. He finds PR in a boxcar on the Terminus grounds, the personal effects of previous travellers. Things that belong to people who did not leave. And then he is locked in a boxcar with most of his group and left to sit with the knowledge of what is going to happen to them. What saves them is Carol Pelletier. Carol's arc across the first 4 seasons is one of the show's most quietly remarkable character progressions. She begins as an abused woman whose husband was a member of the original camp group, a man who controlled her and belittled her and hurt her for years. When he dies in the first season's Walker attack, the show does not make a simple statement about that. It is not presented as relief exactly. It is presented as the opening of a door that Carol did not know how to walk through. By Season 4, Carol has become something else entirely. Practical and cold-eyed in ways that make the other characters uncomfortable. She made a decision, at the prison, to kill 2 sick members of the group who she believed were going to spread a dangerous illness to everyone else. She made this decision alone and carried it out and told no one because she did not think anyone would understand her reasoning. Rick finds out and exiles her from the prison for it, and this decision by Rick haunts both of them for seasons. But the exile is also what puts Carol outside the prison when it falls, and it is Carol, outside the terminus fence with a rifle and a knowledge of how to use it, who triggers the explosion that collapses the terminus community and saves the group from becoming someone's dinner. The reunion in the woods, outside terminus, is the kind of moment that the show knows how to do at its best. Daryl runs to Carol and grabs her and holds on in a way that says everything neither of them would ever say out loud. Rick, who had exiled her, grabs her and holds on, and does not let go for a long moment, and then Carol leads everyone to a cabin nearby, where Tyrese is waiting with Judith, and Rick sees his daughter alive, and there is nothing cinematic about the way he holds her. It is just a man holding his child in the woods. After terminus, the group is heading north, toward Washington, D.C., on the theory of a man named Eugene, who claims to be a scientist with knowledge of what caused the outbreak and how it might be stopped. Eugene is not a scientist, he is not a former government researcher. He is a man with an impressive vocabulary and a gift for telling people what they need to hear in order to keep him alive and moving. He admits this eventually, after Abraham Ford, the military man who has dedicated himself to getting Eugene safely to DC, punches him hard enough to knock him out. The DC trip is abandoned. The group finds a church, they find a hospital in Atlanta, where Beth has been taken by police officers who operate on a kind of forced debt system, taking in injured survivors and then requiring labour in exchange. The rescue of Beth from Grady Memorial Hospital is one of the season's major arcs, and it ends with Beth making a choice that gets her killed in the final seconds of the rescue, a moment so abrupt and so brutal that it still reads, even having seen it as a mistake, as something that cannot have really just happened. Daryl carries her body out of that hospital. Maggie collapses when she sees them coming. The camera holds on this longer than is comfortable. And then they find Alexandria. Alexandria Safe Zone is a walled community in Northern Virginia, about 15 miles outside DC. It was founded and is led by a former congresswoman named Deanna Monroe, who had the foresight and connections to get the neighborhood fully enclosed and stocked before the worst of the outbreak hit. Alexandria has running water, solar power, houses with working plumbing, a pantry with real food, a doctor, a community meeting structure, elections. It has teenagers who have barely experienced the outside world. It has people who have never really had to fight. For Rick's group, Alexandria is the most dangerous thing they have encountered since the prison. And what makes it dangerous is that it looks like what they have been searching for. The temptation to stop, to let the walls do the work, to pretend that the world outside is manageable and that the rules of the old world still apply, is enormous. And the people of Alexandria need Rick's group in ways that create their own kind of power imbalance. The Alexandrians have the infrastructure. Rick's people have the skills and the hardness to survive what is outside the walls. The friction between these two cultures, the hardened survivors, and the community that has stayed relatively safe behind its walls, is the engine of seasons 5 and 6. Rick sees the Alexandrians' naivety as a direct threat to his own people's survival. Some of this is correct tactical assessment. Some of it is something less flattering, a difficulty accepting that not everyone has had to become what he has become, and a corresponding inability to trust anything that does not look like his own kind of survival. The quarry becomes the season's central plot mechanism in season 6. There is a limestone quarry about 15 miles from Alexandria in which a massive herd of walkers has been naturally contained for years, held in by a configuration of trucks and terrain. The quarry is what has kept Alexandria safe by drawing in the regional walker population and trapping it. When the containment fails, as it was always going to, the herd numbers in the thousands, and it is heading directly toward Alexandria. Rick devises a plan to herd the walkers away down a predetermined route using vehicles and noise. It is an enormously ambitious plan, the kind of thing that requires precise coordination across a large group of people, some of whom are not entirely sure they trust Rick's judgment. The plan works until it does not, because a secondary explosion near town draws part of the herd off route and directly toward Alexandria's walls. The mid-season break of Season 6 ends on one of the show's most celebrated and most criticised cliffhangers, with Glenn apparently dead in an alley, surrounded by walkers, his glasses on the ground. The next episode reveals he survived by sliding under a dumpster while the walkers consumed the body of someone else on top of him. The internet, which had mourned Glenn for 3 weeks, responded to his survival with a mixture of relief and irritation that is itself a kind of testament to how much the character mattered to people. But Glenn's survival is temporary, and what comes for him at the end of Season 6 and the beginning of Season 7 is the thing that defines the rest of his presence in the franchise, even after he is gone. Negan Smith is the leader of a group called the Saviors, and the Saviors are, at the point where they are introduced, the largest and most organised post-apocalyptic power structure the show has depicted. They operate out of a facility called the Sanctuary, a former factory that has been converted into a residential and industrial complex. The Sanctuary is run on a system where workers earn points by producing goods, and those points can be exchanged for necessities. The Saviors also control multiple surrounding communities, and each of those communities pays half of everything it produces to the Saviors in tribute. Negan governs through performance. He is tall and loud, and wears a leather jacket and carries a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire that he has named Lucille, after his late wife. He is charismatic in the way that very dangerous people sometimes are, the kind of charismatic that requires an audience that knows they cannot leave. He kills not randomly, but strategically, publicly, as demonstration, as lesson, as reminder. The Saviors are afraid of him, and that fear is what keeps the system running. The group first encounters Savior Scouts in the second half of Season 6, in a series of escalating incidents that end badly each time. Rick's group kills a large number of Saviors in a preemptive strike on one of their outposts, believing, incorrectly, that this will solve the problem. The Saviors are not a small group with a single outpost. They are everywhere. The Season 6 finale assembles most of the main cast on a dark, rural road at night, surrounded by what appears to be several hundred Saviors, with trucks and motorcycles and floodlights. Negan appears. He gives a long, controlled, menacing speech about the new reality of what their lives are going to be. He explains the rules. He chooses someone to make an example of. He swings Lucille. The camera goes to Rick's point of view and then goes dark. The Season 7 premiere reveals who was killed. It is Abraham first, because Abraham made eye contact with Negan and did not break it, and Negan rewarded this with Lucille until there was nothing left of him. And then it is Glenn, because Daryl responded to Abraham's murder by lunging at Negan, and Negan told the group there were no exceptions and no free passes, and demonstrated this by turning to Glenn. Glenn's last words, spoken through catastrophic injury, through something that should not be survivable, and is not, are to Maggie. Maggie, I'll find you. He cannot find her. He cannot stand. Negan finishes what he started, and Glenn Rhee, who has been on this show since its second episode, who has been arguably its most purely good character, who is the father of a child Maggie is carrying, is gone. The show handles the aftermath of this across the entirety of Season 7, which is about what happens to a group of people who have had the will to resist crushed completely. Rick does not fight back. Rick complies. Rick brings tributes to the Sanctuary and smiles when Negan makes him carry Lucille. Rick tells the group they have to live this way now. He is, in this period, almost entirely unlike himself, and the most disturbing thing about it is that it makes sense. He watched two of his people killed in front of him and could not stop it and could not protect anyone, and the lesson he has drawn is that Negan is right about the balance of power. Maggie does not comply. Maggie grieves and buries Glenn, and then stands up and goes to the hilltop, which is another community under Savior control, and begins building something. She has no official position at the hilltop initially. She just starts doing things that need to be done, and people start following her, and by the end of Season 7 she is effectively the hilltop's leader. The Kingdom, another Savior tributary community, is led by a man named Ezekiel, who is a former zookeeper. Ezekiel had a tiger. His tiger, Shiva, is alive and enormous, and walks beside him during his public appearances, and Ezekiel speaks in an elevated, theatrical register, addressing his people as a king might address a court. Carol, who arrives at the Kingdom after a period of self-imposed exile, sees through the performance almost immediately. She asks Ezekiel why he does it. He tells her that the performance holds people together, that people need something to believe in, and he gives them himself as that thing. Carol, who has her own complicated relationship with performance and mask wearing, understands this better than most people would. The all-out war of Season 8 is the result of Rick pulling together Alexandria, the Hilltop, and the Kingdom, convincing them that Negan can be beaten and that fighting back is not suicide. The war is complicated and long and makes strategic mistakes on both sides, and involves a very large number of deaths, including Shiva the tiger, who is killed saving Ezekiel's life, which is the kind of thing that should be absurd but is handled with enough genuine grief by the show that it works. The war ends not with Negan's death but with his capture, because Rick at the last moment chooses to honour a promise he made about rebuilding the world rather than the promise he made to everyone who wanted Negan dead. He slits Negan's throat with a piece of glass and then immediately calls for a doctor because he does not want Negan to die. He wants Negan to live in a cell as proof that the new world can be different from the old one. Maggie does not agree with this decision. Maggie's grief about Glenn is not resolved by the end of the war. It is not going to be resolved by Negan being imprisoned. She goes to the cell where they are keeping him, and she looks at him through the bars and she cries and she leaves. But she does not forget, and she does not forgive, and this unresolved thing between Maggie and Negan is the seed from which Dead City eventually grows. The time jump between Season 8 and Season 9 is the most significant editorial decision the show made in its entire run, and it is also the thing that most confuses people trying to map the franchise's timeline. 6 years pass. 6 years of in-universe time happen off-screen. When Season 9 begins, the communities have been rebuilding. There is a functioning council. There are crops and infrastructure projects. Children who were toddlers are now in school. Rick Grimes has a beard that suggests contentment as much as neglect, and he is riding a horse across a covered bridge project that is meant to connect the communities and allow trade. The horse is an important detail. Everyone who has a horse in The Walking Dead is riding towards something they will not be able to reach. Maggie is the leader of the Hilltop, confirmed and respected. She is raising Herschel, Glenn's son, who is a small boy with his father's eyes. Michonne is in Alexandria, which she effectively runs in Rick's absence. Daryl has retreated from the communities somewhat, living in the woods outside the main settlements, working with Carol to watch the borders. The Season 9 premiere also introduces a tension that is going to matter. Rick and Maggie are not aligned. The war's end, the decision to keep Negan alive, has created a fracture. Rick went one way and Maggie did not follow, and neither of them has found a way to repair this. And then Rick Grimes disappears. The circumstances of his disappearance are not ambiguous in the way the show initially frames them, but they are incomplete in ways that the show would not fully explain for 5 more years. Rick is trying to lead a massive herd away from the communities when a spooked horse throws him. He lands on rebar that goes through his torso. He is losing blood at a rate that is not survivable. He is trying to hold on. He triggers an explosion on the bridge to destroy the herd and save the communities, and the bridge collapses, and the explosion is enormous. And when everyone arrives at the bridge, Rick is not there. Andrew Lincoln, who played Rick Grimes, had decided to leave the show. The creative team built his exit in a way that left the character's fate deliberately open. The audience, along with the surviving characters, sees the explosion and sees the aftermath and does not see a body. Daryl searches, Michonne searches, Carol searches. They do not find him. What the audience sees in a brief scene at the end of the episode is a CRM helicopter landing near the river. Rick is alive on the riverbank. Jadis, who had been a community leader and then a savior collaborator and then an informant for the CRM, the mysterious military organization she had been secretly in contact with for years, has traded Rick to them in exchange for passage into their world. She tells the helicopter pilot that Rick is an A, which is CRM internal classification for a certain type of survivor, and the helicopter takes him away. Michonne does not know this. Daryl does not know this. The communities hold a memorial. They grieve. Life continues. The next 5 or 6 years of in-universe time pass before the main series ends, though the show depicts them in real time through its final 3 seasons. The communities are fractured again by a new threat, the Whisperers, who present a philosophically distinct challenge from anything the group has faced before. The Whisperers wear the skin of walkers. They have been doing this for years, living among the herds, moving with them, using the herd's instinct to avoid and never approach as a kind of camouflage. Their leader, Alpha, played with extraordinary commitment and stillness by Samantha Morton, has built a community around the idea that human civilization is an illusion, that the walkers represent nature's correction, and that survival belongs to those willing to become, as nearly as possible, indistinguishable from the dead. Alpha has a daughter, Lydia, who she raised in the Whisperer's philosophy from childhood. Lydia does not fully believe what her mother believes. When she is captured by Alexandria during a border incident, she forms a connection with Henry, and then more durably, and more importantly, with Daryl. Her eventual defection from the Whisperers to Alexandria is the emotional centre of Season 9's second half. Beta, Alpha's second-in-command, is the physical enforcement of the Whisperer philosophy. He is very large and very quiet, and has internalised Alpha's worldview completely. His backstory, revealed in pieces, involves a former identity as a celebrity of some kind, a singer, which he has erased along with everything else from the before time. He does not like being seen. He wears his mask not just for camouflage, but for the same reason anyone wears a mask. The Whisperer's weapon is the herd. Alpha controls a herd of tens of thousands of walkers, penned in a valley, available to be released at any community she chooses. The threat of the herd is the Whisperer's nuclear deterrent, and Alpha uses it to establish border agreements with the surviving communities. You stay on your side, we stay on ours, and the herd stays in the valley. Carol cannot leave it there. Alpha killed Henry, who was like a son to Carol, and Carol spent the entirety of Season 10 in a state of grief that read clearly as a desire for something she could not quite name, whether it was revenge or her own death, or simply an end to the specific kind of pain she was carrying. She crosses the border repeatedly. She makes decisions that endanger the group. She cannot stop. Alpha is killed by Negan in an arrangement that Carol sets up. Negan has been living in his cell for years at this point, and Carol arranges his release and his apparent turn toward the Whisperers in order to get close enough to Alpha to kill her. Which he does, which is the most complicated thing the show asks you to feel about Negan, that the man who killed Glenn is the man who kills Glenn's killer. Beta dissolves into the herd after Alpha's death. The herd is eventually dispersed in the Season 10 finale in a sequence involving a satellite crash, fire, and a coordinated response from multiple communities that functions as something like a military operation. The Whisperer threat ends. The communities survive it. but they are changed by it, and the change is not entirely in the direction of connection. Season 11 takes the communities into contact with the Commonwealth, a functioning society of approximately 50,000 people headquartered in Ohio. The Commonwealth has a military, a bureaucracy, a class system based on what your job was before the outbreak, a governor and a prison system. It is, in many ways, the most complete vision of what post-apocalyptic reconstruction looks like in the entire franchise. And it is also, in many ways, a perfect reproduction of exactly the things that made the old world unjust. The final season deals with the corruption within the Commonwealth, the abuse of power by the Governor Pamela Milton, and the military's leadership, and the eventual reform of the community from within rather than its destruction from without. This is a deliberate choice by the writers, a statement that the answer to corrupt civilization is not the abandonment of civilization. You fix what you have. You build the better version from the ruins of the existing one. The Walking Dead original series ends with most of the surviving characters alive and building. Alexandria is rebuilding. The communities are connected. Judith Grimes, Rick's daughter, has grown into a young woman who carries her father's gun and her mother's strength and something entirely her own. She does not know where her father is. She does not know if he is alive. She believes he is, and the show does not contradict this belief. And everything that comes next in the spin-offs will eventually tell us she was right. Now let us go back in time, because we left Fear the Walking Dead on a boat off the coast of Baja California, and we need to catch up to where it eventually goes, because Fear the Walking Dead's timeline is one of the most genuinely confusing threads in the whole franchise. Fear's first 2 seasons cover the period of the initial outbreak and its immediate aftermath, which, as we have established, runs roughly parallel to the first season of the original show. Madison Clark and her family are on a boat for most of season 2, which gives the show a different visual texture and a different set of practical problems. On the ocean, there are no roads. There are no herds except the ones you might encounter in the ports you visit. There is the sea itself, which is indifferent to the apocalypse and enormous and deeply calming in a way that Fear uses more skillfully than it is sometimes given credit for. The boat, called the Abigail, eventually takes the group to Mexico and the Mexican coast, and a hotel that has been converted into a community by its staff and remaining guests. This hotel arc in Season 2 is one of Fear's most quietly interesting stretches because it deals with something the original show did not have to deal with for many seasons, which is a community with its own established culture trying to incorporate survivors who operate by a completely different set of rules. The hotel is staffed largely by Mexican workers who were on shift when the outbreak hit and who took it upon themselves to secure the building and create a functioning refuge. They have their own hierarchy, their own norms, their own way of handling the dead. When Madison and her group arrive, the tension is not primarily about walkers. It is about who gets to make decisions in a community that already has a working structure. Madison navigates this with a combination of genuine diplomacy and the kind of underlying steel that the show gradually reveals is her defining characteristic. She is not as visibly forceful as Rick. She does not lead through obvious strength. She leads through accumulation, through being the person who was there when something needed doing and who made herself indispensable and then irreplaceable. The Mexico arc ends badly, as arcs in this universe tend to do. The group moves on. Season 3 takes them to a ranch in the American Southwest, a prepper community that has been doing relatively well behind its walls and its buried water supply. The ranch community is the show's most direct engagement with a specific strand of American political culture. The survivalist tradition, the people who prepared for some version of this long before it happened, and the question of whether the preparations they made were adequate to the reality of what came. They were not in the end adequate. The water supply fails, the community fractures, Nick, Madison's son, makes a series of decisions that cost people their lives. Alicia, Madison's daughter, begins a process of hardening that will eventually leave her the most changed of all the family's survivors. Season 4 of Fear the Walking Dead is where the show's timeline becomes genuinely complicated, because Season 4 executes a time jump that is neither clearly labelled nor consistently maintained in its early episodes. The show shifts its setting to Texas, introduces a set of new characters, including a former soldier named Al, who documents survivor stories on videotapes, and a baseball fan named John Dory, who's been living alone in a cabin for years and has retained a sweetness that the apocalypse has not quite reached, and then introduces Morgan Jones. Morgan crosses over from the original Walking Dead here, and his presence creates an implicit timeline anchor. Morgan left Alexandria at the end of Season 8 of the original show, following the all-out war's end, unable to stay in the community and unable to stop moving. His arrival in Fear's Texas setting puts Fear's timeline in approximate alignment with the original show's Season 9, which means Fear has jumped forward several years from where it was in Season 3. This is not clearly communicated in the episodes themselves, which contributes to the confusion. The show uses flashback and present-day intercuts in Season 4 in a way that makes the chronology deliberately murky, and what you're left with, if you're trying to map it, is the knowledge that somewhere between Season 3 and Season 4 of Fear the Walking Dead, several years passed, and that Fear is now running roughly contemporaneous with or slightly ahead of the original show's later seasons. Madison Clark dies in Season 4, or appears to. She leads a massive herd into a stadium she had helped build into a community and burns them from inside with a flare. And the stadium burns, and she does not come out. Her children believe she is dead. Morgan's group believes she is dead. The show, for several seasons, presents her death as final. It is not final. Madison Clark returns in Season 8, very much alive, having survived the stadium fire and spent years as a prisoner and then as a fugitive from a community called Padre. Her return is one of the franchise's more prolonged and more carefully constructed reveals, and it reframes a significant portion of Fear's middle seasons as the story of people grieving someone who did not actually die. Between Madison's apparent death and her return, Fear the Walking Dead continues with Morgan as its central character, and it ranges widely across the American Southwest and South. It encounters a caravan of strangers. It deals with a radioactive storm in Texas that coats walkers in nuclear fallout. It builds and loses several communities. It depicts a world that is, now a decade or more into the outbreak, neither recovering nor collapsing, but suspended in a kind of chronic emergency that has become the new normal. The CRM appears in Fear the Walking Dead through the character of Al. Her tapes are of interest to the CRM for reasons that are not immediately clear, and she encounters a CRM operative in Season 5 who is investigating the tape's contents. This operative, Isabel, and Al form a brief and significant connection that becomes one of the franchise's more unexpected emotional threads. The CRM is monitoring survivor communities across the continent. They are collecting information, they are making assessments, and they will act on those assessments as Fear's survivors eventually discover. By its 8th and final season, Fear the Walking Dead has moved its setting again, this time to the American East, in and around the community called Padre, a self-contained island society built around children. The children of Padre are separated from their parents, trained in the community's practices, and expected to reproduce that community's values without the sentimentality of family attachment. It is the Whisperer's philosophy applied to a more structured setting. Children raised not to mourn what they have lost, because they have never been permitted to have it. Madison dismantles Padre. She finds her people. She chooses connection over efficiency in a way that costs her and saves everyone at the same time. Fear the Walking Dead ends with something that functions as hope, qualified and fragile and real. In terms of where Fear's final season sits on the timeline, it is the furthest forward any Walking Dead property has gone. The outbreak has been going for approximately 12 years. The world the show depicts is no longer in acute crisis. It is chronic. It is the world that will exist for another generation. The world that Judith Grimes is growing up in. The world that the children of Padre are inheriting. It is not a good world. It is a survivable one. World Beyond is the franchise's most deliberately focused spin-off, a 2-season limited series set roughly 10 years after the outbreak, running approximately concurrent with the original show's final seasons. It follows a small group of young people who have grown up entirely inside the walls of the campus colony in Nebraska, a community with schools and libraries and something like normalcy, who leave for the first time on a cross-country journey. The campus colony exists in relationship with the CRM. The CRM provides resources and protection. The campus colony provides research output from its university base. The relationship is presented to the colonists as a partnership, but as the show develops, it becomes clear that the CRM's version of partnership and the colonists' version are not the same thing. Hope Bennett and her sister Iris are the show's central figures. Hope is, in some ways, the franchise's most interesting young character, because she is genuinely complex in ways that the show does not always earn, but sometimes does. She is smart and difficult and self-aware about being difficult in ways that do not actually prevent the difficulty. Iris is steadier, more committed to specific goals, and the two sisters' relationship is the emotional core of whatever World Beyond does successfully. The CRM's presence in World Beyond is the connective tissue between this show and the ones who live. The Civic Republic military is developed here in more detail than anywhere else before the Rick and Michonne spin-off. The show depicts the CRM's operations, its research programs, its relationship with its civilian component, the Civic Republic, and its approach to what it calls the algorithm, the calculation of which communities represent the best investment of resources and which represent a liability. Communities that are a liability to the CRM do not continue to exist. The campus colony eventually discovers this. Omaha, which is another community that the CRM was supposedly allied with, has already been destroyed by the time the show reveals this information. The destruction of Omaha is presented not as an isolated decision, but as standard operating procedure for an organization that has decided that consolidation is the only viable path to human survival. The CRM's logic is not irrational, which is what makes it disturbing. Their modelling shows that humanity is losing to the walker population and to the secondary effects of civilizational collapse. Starvation, disease, the sheer exhaustion of permanent survival mode existence. Their estimate, articulated in The Ones Who Live, is that humanity has approximately 14 years left. Their solution is to concentrate resources and population in the Civic Republic, destroy competitors and potential threats, and use the resulting security and stability to drive the scientific breakthroughs that might actually solve the underlying problem. This logic produces monsters. It also produces the Civic Republic itself, a city of 200,000 people with functioning infrastructure, healthcare, education, arts, agriculture, and all the things that make a civilization worth surviving for. The CRM is the army that sustains this city by doing things the city does not want to know about. World Beyond ends with the siblings and their allies making choices that undermine the CRM's control of the research program, that protect specific scientific work that could lead to actual treatment or cure, and that establish that the CRM's monopoly on power is not as complete as it appears. It is a quieter ending than the franchise's other shows tend to produce, and a more optimistic one in the sense that it presents the CRM as something that can be challenged, and perhaps eventually changed. The post-credits sequence of World Beyond series finale is one of the most significant pieces of connective tissue in the whole franchise. It depicts a French scientist, in what is clearly a European setting, watching a video message from an American CRM researcher. The French scientist's response to this message is rage. She smashes a monitor. She indicates that what the CRM has done with her research is not what she intended. And she mentions in French that this has to stop. This is the seed of Daryl Dixon's France, planted years before that show would premiere. Before we get to Daryl in France, and to Rick and Michonne's story, which is the thread that ties the most of this together, let us talk about what happens to some of the original show's other key characters in the years immediately after the main series ends. Carole Pelletier does not stay in the Commonwealth. Carole's story has always been about motion, about the difficulty of staying in any one place long enough to be found by the things she's running from. After the original series ends, she's working on a project, a train line, a connection between communities that will allow trade and movement and something like normalcy. She is doing this partly because it is useful, and partly because useful work has always been Carole's preferred method of not thinking about the things she cannot stop thinking about. Daryl's departure for France is the thing that sets the events of the Daryl Dixon spin-off in motion, and it is tied, at least in the show's backstory, to a period of searching. Daryl spent years looking for Rick after his disappearance. He never found him. He was, at the point where the spin-off begins, on a boat that something went wrong with, and he wakes up on the coast of France with no clear memory of how he got there and no way to communicate with anyone back home. France has its own version of the apocalypse, and it is not quite the same as America's. The walkers in France, the French call them the morts vivants, but the show's English-speaking characters call them walkers or burners or the dead depending on who is talking, have developed a particular variant behaviour. Some of them produce an acidic secretion, a dark viscous substance that burns whatever it touches, including human skin. This makes them more dangerous than the standard walker in close combat because even a glancing touch can cause a serious wound. The biological explanation for this is not fully developed in the first 2 seasons of Daryl Dixon, but the French scientific community has been working on understanding the infection since the beginning of the outbreak, and some of their research has implications for the broader understanding of what the pathogen is and whether it can be addressed. This research connection to the post-credits World Beyond scene is explicit and intentional. Daryl finds himself embedded with a religious community called the Nest, operating out of a medieval monastery in the south of France. The community is led by a nun named Isabel, who is pragmatic and courageous in ways that the religious framework does not contain or explain. It just accompanies. Her nephew Laurent is a young boy who may have been born with a biological distinction from other survivors, born to a mother who died and reanimated and then somehow delivered him, which should not be possible, and whose existence is significant to the scientific community's work on the infection. Laurent is being protected. Multiple factions want access to him, some for research and some for protection, and some for reasons that are harder to characterize. Daryl, who has never had an easy time walking away from a child who needs someone to walk toward them, stays. The secondary antagonists of the first season of Daryl Dixon include a group called Pouvoir, a fascist organisation that has taken advantage of the collapse to implement a kind of ethnic nationalism with an apocalyptic flavour. They are not interesting as villains in the way that the Governor or Negan or Alpha were interesting. They are a type rather than individuals, but they function adequately as a reason for Daryl and the Nest community to keep moving. What the first season of Daryl Dixon does well is France itself. The show was filmed on location, and the result is a Walking Dead that looks genuinely unlike any previous iteration of the franchise. Ancient stone buildings in various states of collapse. vineyards and rivers, and the Pont du Gard standing in the background of a world that has lost everything except the physical evidence of its own long history. Medieval architecture as a backdrop for post-apocalyptic survival creates an aesthetic that the show leans into thoughtfully, because medieval people also had to think about walls and water supply and the organisation of labour and the defence of communities. The show draws this parallel without being heavy-handed about it. Carol appears at the end of Season 1 of Daryl Dixon, having crossed the Atlantic to find him. Her arrival at the end of the first season finale is the show's biggest emotional payoff, and it changes the texture of Season 2, which involves both of them trying to navigate French apocalyptic politics while figuring out whether they're going home and what home means now. Season 3 of Daryl Dixon expands the scope further, moving into Spain and beginning to suggest that the European theatre of the outbreak is connected to the American one in ways that go beyond the Nest's religious mission and into something that involves the CRM's international reach. The full implications of this have not yet been developed as of the most recent available episodes, but the connective tissue is clearly being laid. Now, Rick Grimes, The Ones Who Live, is a 6-episode limited series that aired in 2024, set approximately 9 years after Rick's disappearance from the bridge in Georgia. Rick has been inside the Civic Republic for all of that time. The Civic Republic is in Philadelphia, or what remains of it, and it is genuinely extraordinary by the standards of the post-apocalyptic world. The population is measured in hundreds of thousands. There are hospitals and libraries and concerts and restaurants and apartment buildings with functioning elevators. There is a government, a civilian council that is theoretically in charge, and a military, the CRM, that is theoretically accountable to that government. In practice, the CRM is accountable to no one. The organisation was built by a general named Beale, who led Pennsylvania National Guard forces in the early days of the outbreak and made the decision to sacrifice Pittsburgh to save Philadelphia. His logic was utilitarian and cold. You cannot hold two fronts. You pick the one you can win. You let the other go. He let Pittsburgh go. He saved Philadelphia. And then he spent the years since building the military apparatus that would ensure Philadelphia could never be threatened again, including by the truth of what the CRM actually does. Rick has been trying to escape for years. Every time he gets close, something stops him. The CRM has leverage over him in the form of information about the communities back home. If Rick reveals sensitive information, or if Rick escapes and is caught, the CRM will send reclamation teams to Alexandria and the Hilltop and the Kingdom and kill everyone. This is not a bluff. Rick has seen the evidence of what reclamation teams do. The CRM destroyed Omaha and its campus colony because Omaha was assessed as a resource risk. They destroyed an entire community. Killing a few hundred people in Virginia would not cost them a thought. So Rick stays. He does what they tell him. He advances through the ranks, becoming a significant figure in the CRM's military structure, a frontliner, someone who goes out into the world and clears territory and eliminates threats and brings back resources. He does this for 9 years. He loses his left hand, which was amputated early in his captivity after an injury sustained during an escape attempt. He has a prosthetic. He uses it the way you use something you did not choose and have decided to stop being angry about. He also has Jadis, who is the person who brought him here, and who has spent 9 years managing the information she has about Rick's home communities in a way that keeps her positioned within the CRM's power structure. Jadis is, in The Ones Who Live, one of the more fully realised characters in the franchise. A woman who made a terrible choice and then spent 9 years inhabiting the consequences of it so completely that the consequences became her identity. She is a warrant officer, takes to find Rick is itself a multi-year takes to find Rick is itself a multi-year journey. She spent years after his disappearance in Alexandria, raising Judith and RJ, holding things together, never fully accepting the memorial service, never quite willing to say the word dead in connection with his name. She finds evidence that he might be alive in a set of iPhones she discovers, while on a supply run far from home. iPhones with images carved into them of herself and Judith, and a boy who is Carl, images that Rick had commissioned from an artist in the Civic Republic because he needed to see them. This is the show's most quietly devastating detail. Rick, trapped inside the most powerful military organization in the post-apocalyptic world, spent years asking a street artist to carve portraits of his family into old phones, because that was the closest he could get to seeing them. He has a collection of them. The artist, a young man named Benjiro, knows their names. He knows Judith's face because Rick described her in enough detail that Benjiro could draw her from description alone. He knows Carl, though he could never get Carl quite right because Rick could not find the words for Carl. When Michonne finally arrives at the Civic Republic, posing under a false name, and finds Benjiro's stand, and sees the phones and recognizes the carvings, she understands in one moment where Rick has been and what it cost him to be there. Their reunion, when it finally happens, is not the explosion the audience might have anticipated. Rick has built walls. 9 years of walls. He told himself certain stories to survive. Stories about why he could not leave, why he had to stay, why coming home would get everyone he loved killed. When Michonne stands in front of him, those stories are still there, and they are in conflict with everything he feels, and the conflict is visible in every scene they share in the first few episodes of the series. What The Ones Who Live does, at its best, is depict a long marriage that has survived an impossible separation by being a long marriage. Rick and Michonne know each other in the way that people who have lived through extraordinary things together know each other, at a depth that does not require explanation or warm-up. They also have 9 years of separation to navigate, 9 years during which each of them became something the other has not yet seen. The show takes its time with this. It earns most of it. The CRM's plan, revealed in the series' penultimate episode, is the thing that finally resolves Rick's paralysis. The CRM is planning to destroy Portland, its last remaining alliance partner, in a coordinated action that will kill tens of thousands of people and consolidate all power and resources in Philadelphia. General Beale presents this plan to Rick in a private briefing as a gesture of trust as the final step in Rick's full integration into the CRM's inner circle. Rick, in that room, listening to the plan for the destruction of Portland, has to choose between the story he has been telling himself for 9 years and the thing he actually is. And Rick Grimes is the man who blew up a bridge to save his people. He is not a person who can hear a plan to murder tens of thousands of civilians and decide that the walls around his own grief are more important. He and Michonne act. They expose the CRM's plan to the Civic Republic civilian population, which does not know what the CRM does outside the city. They destroy the weapon system that would be used to carry out the attack. They eliminate the operational command that was driving the plan. They do not destroy the CRM entirely, which is not something two people could do, but they alter the trajectory of an organization that had been moving without accountability for a decade, and they give the civilian government a chance to reassert control, and then they drive home. The final scene of The Ones Who Live is Rick and Michonne in a truck, driving away from Philadelphia, heading south, heading home, heading toward Judith and RJ and Alexandria and everything that was on hold for 9 years. They are laughing about something. The specifics of the conversation are not what matters. What matters is the sound of it. Two people who have survived something enormous and are still capable of laughing together in a car, They are going home. The road is long, but they are going. Dead City is the spin-off that deals most directly with the personal aftermath of the original show's most painful moment, which is the murder of Glenn Rhee. It is set approximately 12 years after the outbreak, placing it at roughly the same time as Fear the Walking Dead's final season and slightly ahead of where the original show ends. Maggie Rhee is in her early to mid-40s. Herschel, Glenn's son, is a teenager. Negan is somewhere in his mid-50s, grey-bearded, still wearing versions of his leather jacket, because some things about a person do not change even after 12 years of apocalypse. The premise of Dead City requires you to accept two things. The first is that Negan has genuinely changed since the war, not in the sense of having been redeemed in some abstract moral accounting, but in the sense that the person he was when he killed Glenn is not exactly the person he is 12 years later. The second is that this does not matter to Maggie, and that it should not necessarily matter to you either, and that both of these truths can coexist without resolving into a tidy conclusion. The show does not ask you to forgive Negan. It does not ask Maggie to forgive Negan. It asks both of them to be in the same space for long enough to save her son, and it watches what that does to them. The setting is Manhattan. The island of Manhattan was sealed off during the early weeks of the outbreak, when the military destroyed the bridges and tunnels in an attempt to contain what was already too far gone to contain. Manhattan is now home to one of the densest walker populations anywhere in the country, 1.5 million pre-outbreak residents whose remains have been wandering the island for 12 years. The streets are flooded in places, the infrastructure of the island failing slowly under a combination of walker damage, 12 years of neglect, and the natural process of a city being reclaimed by water and plants and whatever else was waiting for the humans to leave. There are also living people in Manhattan. A small surviving population has built various kinds of community on the island, in different boroughs, in different buildings, under different organisational frameworks. The most significant of these, from the plot's perspective, is a group called the Burazi, controlled by a man known as the Croat. The Croat is a former saviour. He was in Negan's orbit during the original series, a true believer who carried the saviour's philosophy further and harder than Negan himself eventually did. He lost an ear when Negan shot him, during a period when Negan was making examples of people who had overstepped, and he carries this loss as both a physical scar and an organising grievance. He has built something in Manhattan, not a community exactly, more of a court, something organised around his own personality and will in the way that the Sanctuary was organised around Negan's. The Burazi have Herschel. Maggie's son was taken in circumstances the show reveals gradually across its first season, and recovering him means entering Manhattan, which means dealing with the Croat, which means using Negan as the instrument of that dealing, because Negan is the only person the Croat has a relationship with, even if that relationship is complicated by the ear situation. Negan is living under a different name when Maggie finds him. He is working as a walker clearer for a motel, a paid service that several small communities employ, living quietly in a room with a child named Ginny, who does not speak and who has attached herself to him in the way that children who have survived terrible things sometimes attach to the first person who makes them feel safe. Negan did not seek this responsibility. He is not entirely sure what to do with it, but he is not walking away from it either, which tells you something about where 12 years have taken him. Maggie takes Negan to Manhattan not because she trusts him, and she does not. She says so clearly and repeatedly, but because she needs what he can do. She needs his relationship with the Croat. She needs his knowledge of how the Saviour's network was built and what the Croat would respond to. She needs him specific and functional, and that requires tolerating him present, which is the hardest thing she's been asked to do. There is a scene in the first episode of Dead City where Maggie and Negan are in the back of a truck in the dark, driving toward the coast, and Negan asks Maggie what the plan is. She tells him she has a plan. He asks what it is. She says he does not need to know yet. He says that is probably fair. And there is a silence between them that contains 12 years of things. Neither of them is going to say. Glenn in that silence, Herschel in that silence. All the grief and all the fury and all the exhausted, unanswerable question of whether the man sitting across from her is the same man who killed her husband, or whether something has happened in the intervening time that changes the accounting. The show does not answer this. It is smart enough not to answer this. The most honest thing Dead City does is to sit with the impossibility of the question and let both of them sit with it too. Manhattan itself is gorgeous and terrible in the way that a city in slow collapse tends to be. The show was filmed in New York with significant production design work to suggest a specific way that 12 years of abandonment would change the city. The skyscrapers are intact, because skyscrapers are built to last. But the streets below are not, which the show frames in the background of the show, which the show frames in the background of shots with a frequency that shifts from establishing detail to something closer to motif. Liberty, visible, inaccessible, still standing. The Croat is found. The negotiation happens, and it is complicated by the fact that the Croat does not simply want to return Herschel in exchange for any straightforward thing. He has his own economy, his own logic, his own grief and grievance around Negan, and the transaction that gets Herschel back involves Negan making a choice about who he is that the show will continue to develop in subsequent seasons. There is also a figure in Dead City called the Dharma, a woman who is the effective power behind the Croats operation, who has her own reasons for wanting access to Herschel that the show reveals in its later episodes. The Dharma is not the most original villain the franchise has produced, but her presence provides a layer of political complexity that prevents Dead City's antagonist structure from being as simple as it might otherwise be. Herschel is rescued. The rescue costs things. It cost Negan something that he was working to protect, and it costs Maggie the resolution she thought she wanted, because the resolution is not available in the form she imagined it. You cannot murder your way to peace. You cannot extract justice from the past by performing it in the present. She comes close to killing Negan at the end of the first season's final episode. She does not. She leaves Manhattan with her son. What happens to Herschel at the end of Dead City's second season is significant for the broader franchise. He makes choices that connect him to the Dharma's world, that suggest his story is not going to be a simple journey back to safety and normalcy. He is, at this point, his own person, with his own grief and his own anger and his own way of processing what happened to his father, and what is happening to him now, and what is going to happen next. He is not Glenn, he is not Maggie, he is Herschel Jr., and what that means is still being established. The thing that ties all of these shows together, when you look at the whole franchise as a single long narrative, is not any specific plot thread, though there are plot threads connecting them. It is a question. The same question, asked in different ways by different characters, across different shows and different settings, and different points on the timeline. The question is this: what do you owe to the person you used to be? Rick Grimes is a former sheriff's deputy who tried to protect people, and whose world was rearranged around him while he was unconscious. The person he is in Season 1, the man who rides into Atlanta on a horse, because that is the direction he thinks his family went, is connected to the person he is in, the ones who live by a thread that has been pulled and stretched and nearly broken multiple times, but never cut. He is still trying to protect people. He is still the person who will blow up a bridge if that is what it costs. He is still, at the end of 9 years of captivity inside the most powerful military organization in the post-apocalyptic world, the man who cannot hear a plan to murder civilians and stay quiet about it. Michonne Hawthorne is a woman who survived the earliest days of the outbreak alone, who built a way of surviving that was almost entirely self-sufficient, who had to be taught by Andrea and then by the prison community how to accept help and connection and the vulnerability that comes with them. The person she is in The Ones Who Live, who crosses an ocean to find her husband, who poses under a false name and infiltrates a military organization and refuses to leave without him, is the fully realized version of the person who walked out of the forest in Season 3 with her sword and her 2 armless walker companions and asked if she could sit by the fire for a while. Daryl Dixon is a man who spent his whole life before the outbreak being told he was not worth anything except as an instrument of his brother Merle's will, who discovered in the apocalypse that he was actually extraordinary, capable, and loyal, and possessed of a kind of care for other people that he would never have described as care, because he does not describe things that way. The Daryl who ends up in France, riding through the ruins of Normandy on a motorcycle, is still that same person, still more comfortable with action than with words, still forming his deepest attachments obliquely, and then defending them with everything he has. Maggie Green is the farmer's daughter, who fell in love with the pizza delivery man during the end of the world, and lost him 12 years later to a man with a baseball bat. Chose the hilltop back, who chose the hilltop back, who made Alexandria and the kingdom and Oceanside into a coalition, who stood over Glenn's grave and decided that the grief was not going to be the last word. The Maggie who crosses into Manhattan in Dead City is all of these things at once. Negan is the most complicated figure in the franchise's accounting because the show invested years in establishing him as an irredeemable monster, and then spent the following years exploring what that word actually means and whether it has a horizon. He killed Glenn. That is not erasable, and the show does not try to erase it. It also shows, over and over, the specific shape of who Negan is, when he is not performing the leader role, when he is not Negan but Philip, or something close to it, when he is quietly attached to a mute child named Ginny, or having a conversation with Maggie in the dark of a truck that neither of them can quite bring themselves to finish. The Walking Dead universe does not resolve any of this neatly. That is the honest thing about it. It does not tell you that survival makes you good, or that suffering earns you anything, or that the people who did terrible things can be either simply forgiven or simply condemned. It puts them in rooms together and makes them deal with each other and watches what happens when 12 years of history has to find a way to share space with whatever comes next. And it keeps going. That is perhaps the most accurate thing to say about this franchise at this point in its existence. It keeps going. The world it depicts keeps going. The people in it keep going. The ones who survive keep going, keep moving, keep building and losing and building again. The timeline is confusing because the story is long, and the story is long because the people in it are interesting, and the people in it are interesting because the writers, at their best, understand something true about what it means to be human in conditions of extremity. You do not simplify. You do not become a type. You carry your whole history with you into every room, every decision, every morning where you wake up, and the world is still the same broken world, and you still have to figure out what to do in it. Now let us put it all in order, one more time, slowly, so that the timeline sits clearly in your mind as you're drifting. Year 0. The outbreak begins. Fear the Walking Dead begins in the last days before the collapse. Los Angeles loses power neighborhood by neighborhood. The National Guard moves in. Rick Grimes is shot in the line of duty and goes into a coma in a hospital in King County, Georgia, weeks later. Rick wakes up. The hospital is empty. He begins moving. Fear the Walking Dead is showing the simultaneous loss of Los Angeles, the Clark family on their boat, the beginning of the Mexican arc. These two stories are running in parallel on opposite sides of a continent that no longer has functioning communication infrastructure connecting them. Year 1. Rick finds Laurie and Carl outside Atlanta. The farm, the search for Sophia, the loss of the farm, Fear the Walking Dead is in Mexico, at the hotel, dealing with its own version of everything the original show is dealing with. Year 1.5. The prison. The governor. Woodbury. The first war between them. The death of Herschel. The fall of the prison. The road. Terminus. Carol saves everyone. Fear the Walking Dead is at the ranch in the southwest, then beginning its time jump. Year 2. Alexandria. The quarry. The Saviour's arrival. Fear the Walking Dead has jumped forward and is now in Texas, introducing Morgan and the new cast members. The timelines are now roughly aligned. Years 2 through 4. The All-Out War. Negan. The Sanctuary. The Hilltop. The Kingdom. The deaths of Glenn and Abraham. The long season of compliance followed by the rebellion. The war's end. Negan in a cell. Maggie not coming back from the hilltop. Year 4+. The time jump. 6 years pass. Season 9 begins. Rick is alive and building. Michonne is running Alexandria. Daryl is in the woods. The Whisperers are coming. Fear the Walking Dead is in the same rough period, dealing with the aftermath of Madison's apparent death. Morgan leading a found family across the southwest. Year 10. Rick disappears from the bridge. The CRM takes him. The communities grieve. The Whisperers fully emerge as a threat. Alpha and Beta and the herd in the valley. Carol's grief spiraling into something dangerous. Negan eventually killing Alpha. The herd dispersed. Years 10 through 12. The Commonwealth arc. The season 11 storyline. The original show ends with the communities intact, damaged but standing, connected by trade and cooperation, ruled imperfectly but ruled by the people who live in them. Judith is a young woman with her father's gun. Simultaneously, Rick has been inside the Civic Republic for years. The CRM is building towards something. Well beyond is happening, with its young people from the campus colony making their cross-country journey, uncovering the truth about the CRM's methods, protecting the research that might matter. Year 12. Fear the Walking Dead concludes with Madison Clark alive and rebuilding. The Civic Republic exists. The CRM is the most powerful military in North America. Maggie and Negan go to Manhattan in Dead City. Daryl is in France. Rick and Michonne fight their way out of the CRM's power structure and drive south. The stories are not over. They are continuing in production, continuing in the characters' lives, continuing in the world that the franchise has spent 15 years building. But this is the shape of them. This is the thread you can follow through all of it. Year 0 to year 12. From a man waking up in a hospital to a city of 200,000 people trying to decide whether its military is accountable to the values it claims to protect. From Sophia lost in the woods outside Atlanta to Herschel Jr. making his own choices in flooded Manhattan. From a horse walking into Atlanta to a truck driving south through Yellowstone with two people laughing about something. That is the timeline. That is all of it. Laid flat, held still long enough to look at. It is a long story. It was always going to be a long story. The world it depicts does not simplify. The people in it do not resolve. And the most honest thing the franchise ever did was refuse to end it cleanly. Refuse to give it a final word. Refuse to draw the line that says, this is what it meant. And now it is over. It is not over. It keeps going. Let us stay a while longer in some of the quieter corners of this universe, the places that a timeline summary tends to skip over, but that are in many ways where the franchise is most itself. There is a farmhouse in rural Virginia. In the years just after the All-Out War, the war has ended. The saviors have been incorporated into the communities as workers and residents rather than enemies, which is its own ongoing experiment in whether people can actually change the categories they have been assigned. The farmhouse is not a specific farmhouse from any episode. It is the idea of one, the image that the show returns to repeatedly as shorthand for what the characters are fighting toward. A field with something growing in it. A porch, Morning light that is just light, not a warning. The Walking Dead universe is, at its foundation, a story about what people are willing to endure and build and lose, and build again in order to have something that looks like that farmhouse. Every character in every show is oriented towards some version of it, whether they know it or not. Even Negan, in his worst years, was trying to build a version of safety and order and the knowledge that tomorrow would exist, just one that happened to require other people's suffering to sustain it. Even Alpha, who rejected civilization entirely, was trying to protect something, a way of surviving that she could pass to Lydia, a set of skills and a philosophy that would let her daughter live in the world as Alpha understood it. The tragedy of Alpha is not that she was wrong about the world being dangerous. She was right about that. The tragedy is that she confused the tools of survival with survival itself. She turned the mask into an identity. She turned the walker's indifference into a value system. She taught her daughter to kill what she loved, because love was a liability, and then spent several seasons of television slowly discovering that this was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. More dangerous than any walker, more dangerous than any whisperer border negotiation. You cannot hollow yourself out to survive without eventually discovering there is nothing left inside to protect. This is the mirror that the show holds up to its more successful characters. Rick survives 9 years of captivity inside the CRM, not because he hollows himself out, but because he does not. He carves portraits of his family into old phones. He keeps wanting to go home. He keeps the specific wound of his separation from Michonne and Judith and everyone else open, which is painful but also necessary, because the wound is the evidence of who he is. If it heals, he becomes something else. He keeps it open. Michonne spends those same 9 years as a mother who is also a searcher. She runs Alexandria. She raises her children. She handles what needs to be handled. And she keeps looking. She keeps following threads that most people around her have accepted as dead ends. She finds the phones because she has not accepted that Rick is dead. Not internally. Not in the place where the decision lives. Even if she has given the children something like an explanation, and given the community something like a conclusion, and given herself something like permission to keep living. This is the emotional core of The Ones Who Live, and it is the thing that makes it, for all its dramatic action plotting and its CRM conspiracy thriller trappings, fundamentally a love story. Not a simple love story, not a romantic comedy in a world with walkers, but a love story in the old sense, the sense where love is not a feeling but a decision, and not a destination but a direction, something you keep pointing yourself toward even when you cannot see it. The scene where Rick and Michonne finally actually reunite. Not the careful managed false encounters in the Civic Republic where they are performing for audiences and keeping each other at arm's length, but the real one, in a parking structure in the dark with no one watching, is one of the best pieces of acting in the franchise's run. Andrew Lincoln and Danai Gurira do something with that scene that does not require description, only acknowledgement. 9 years, and then just the two of them in a parking structure, not saying the things they would say if they were characters in a movie, just being in the same place at the same time, with no performance required. Morgan Jones appears across the franchise more than any character, except Rick himself, and his arc is the one that most directly addresses the question that the show has been circling since the beginning, which is whether violence is a tool or a destination. Morgan began the franchise as the ordinary man in the house, the one who could not pull the trigger. He spent years in isolation after Dwayne died, years in which his grief curdled into something that looked from the outside like madness, but was from the inside a very logical response to an intolerable situation. He cleared every walker he could find, and he wrote the things he thought on the walls and the floors, and eventually on his own skin, and he did this because it was the only action available to him that felt like it corresponded to the scale of what he had lost. Rick finds him again in Season 3, in the town he has been clearing, and Morgan attacks Rick before recognizing him, and the conversation they have in that cleared building is one of the show's most direct engagements with trauma as a physical thing, as something that changes the body and the behaviour before the mind has finished processing it. Morgan is eventually pulled back into community by Eastman, a forensic psychiatrist who survived the early outbreak in a cabin in Georgia and who practices Aikido and who has a philosophy of life that boils down to all life is precious. Morgan finds this philosophy genuinely and immediately ludicrous, given what he has seen and done and lost. He also cannot walk away from it because Eastman is gentle in the way that genuinely strong people sometimes are. The kind of gentle that is not the absence of force but its redirection. The philosophy takes. Morgan carries it forward into the original show's later seasons with a commitment that the other characters find alternately admirable and infuriating, because the show is honest about the fact that all life is precious is an impossible principle to apply cleanly in a world where sometimes the choice is genuinely between one life and another. Morgan cannot always hold the line he has drawn. The moments when he cannot, the moments when he kills because he must or because he cannot stop himself, are the moments the show uses to probe the edges of the philosophy rather than endorse it simply. When Morgan crosses over to Fear the Walking Dead, he carries this philosophy into a different community with a different set of problems and a different cast of characters who challenge it from angles the original show had not explored. The Texas arc of Fear is, in large part, about Morgan trying to find a version of the philosophy that holds under conditions he did not encounter in Virginia or Georgia, and about the ways in which community itself sometimes requires you to do things that contradict your stated principles. By Fear's final seasons, Morgan has become something close to what Eastman was, a kind of teacher and anchor for the people around him. Not a leader exactly, or not only that, a person who holds a position with enough steadiness that other people can orient by it. He has not fixed the world, he has not solved the outbreak, or ended the violence, or created anything that will certainly outlast him, but he has been, consistently and over a very long period, a person who tried to treat other people as though their lives mattered. And in the world of The Walking Dead, that is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. Let us talk about some of the characters who did not survive the journey, because any honest accounting of this timeline has to include the ones who are gone, and what their absence means. Glenn Rhee. He is the character whose death most clearly defines the franchise's second half, because his death is the event against which everything that comes after is measured. He was, by the point of his death, 7 seasons into the show, one of its most beloved characters, and he was killed in a manner so deliberate and so prolonged that the show's creative team clearly intended it as an irreversible statement about the cost of the world they had built. There is no coming back from what happened to Glenn. There is no softening of it, no revision, no alternate reading. He died protecting Maggie with the last coherent thought available to him, and then he was gone, and the world of the show changed permanently in the space of a few minutes of television. His presence is felt in every subsequent Maggie scene, in every subsequent Negan scene, in every scene with Herschel Jr., in Dead City's entire premise. Glenn is not gone from the franchise. He is everywhere in it. He is the weight that Maggie carries into Manhattan and the face that Herschel sees when he looks at himself in a mirror, and the thing that Negan cannot undo and knows he cannot undo. Abraham Ford is also gone from that road, taken seconds before Glenn, and Abraham's death is almost more shocking in its immediacy, its lack of ceremony. Abraham is a man who decided to live after wanting to die, who found a reason to keep going after the person who was his reason was gone, who became, in his own way, one of the show's best arguments for the regenerative capacity of a human being with something to move toward. He died on a road in Virginia at the beginning of season 7, and the show honoured him by not giving his death any more weight than the randomness of who Negan chose to make an example of, because that randomness was exactly the point. Herschel Green is gone from the prison yard, and his death is the one that most directly represents the failure of the old world's values in the new one. Herschel was the last character in the original show who genuinely believed, for most of his screen time, that goodness was a durable principle. He believed in mercy. He believed in rehabilitation, even for walkers, until he was shown incontrovertibly that he was wrong. He adapted. He became harder without becoming cruel. He was the group's doctor, and its conscience and its anchor to the idea that how you treat people matters even when you do not have to treat them well. The governor beheading him in front of his daughters, in front of Rick, in front of everyone, was the show's most precise articulation of what nihilism does when it encounters decency. Carl Grimes survived longer than many viewers expected and was killed in season 8 in a death that the show did not handle, as well as Herschel's or Glenn's, partly because of the logistics of writing out a character who was supposed to have a major role in the story's next phase. Carl was bitten during the season 8 mid-season break, in a moment of genuine self-sacrifice, helping a stranger, and spent the mid-season finale saying goodbye to his father and delivering a speech about the world he hoped Rick would build. His death pushed Rick toward the mercy that ended the all-out war. It is the right narrative function for Carl's exit. The exit itself is still abrupt in ways that the show struggled to fully absorb. Beth Green is gone from the hospital, in a scene of such sudden and specific violence that it functions almost as a challenge to the audience's expectation that the show would warn them before removing someone they cared about. The warning was not given. Beth raised a pair of scissors to threaten a police officer and was shot through the head before the shot registered as having happened. Daryl carried her body out. Emily Kinney's performance across seasons 4 and 5 of the show built a character who could have gone further, who had things to do, and whose removal at the last moment of her rescue was one of the show's most effective deployments of arbitrariness as a narrative tool. Carol is, remarkably, still alive across everything. Carol Pelletier, the abused wife from season 1 who could not protect herself, is still going in Daryl Dixon's France arc, having survived more seasons of television than almost any other character in the franchise. Her survival is not miraculous in the sense of being implausible. It is miraculous in the sense of being earned, the result of a character whose arc has been the franchise's most carefully drawn transformation, from the woman who could not lift a hand to the woman who walked into Terminus with a rifle and burned it to the ground. She is, in the France arc, still Carol, still practical, still capable of extraordinary violence in service of specific attachments, still carrying the grief for the children she has lost, Sophia and Henry, and every other child whose safety she could not guarantee, still in some fundamental way herself, which is the most that the franchise can offer anyone as a form of victory. The world the Walking Dead franchise has built over 15 years of television is not a happy world. It would be dishonest to call it that. It is a world that began with the death of billions of people and has been living with the consequences of that death ever since. The survivors in it have lost more than most people in any fictional universe, and the losses have not made them better in any simple or automatic way. Loss does not purify, grief does not clarify, survival does not transform a person into a hero. What the franchise is honest about is that people keep going anyway. They lose and they grieve and they build something and they lose it and they grieve again and they build again. They form attachments that they know are dangerous and they form them anyway, because the alternative is to be alone in a world that will kill you faster alone than it will in company. They hurt each other and forgive each other, or do not forgive each other, or forgive each other in pieces over very long periods of time, in the irregular and incomplete way that forgiveness actually works. They are, in this sense, the most human characters in a genre that does not always insist on its characters being human. The zombie genre has often used its undead as a way of examining what is left of us when civilization is stripped away, usually arriving at the conclusion that what is left is not especially flattering. The Walking Dead arrived at a more complicated conclusion. What is left in this universe is the whole complicated mess of us, the pettiness and the heroism, the grief that makes you dangerous and the love that makes you vulnerable, the capacity to do terrible things and the capacity, sometimes, to stop. The timeline of this universe is confusing because the universe is large and because the stories in it overlap and contradict and circle back and jump forward and refuse to stay in the boxes that a timeline chart would like to put them in. It is confusing in the way that 15 years of any ongoing human story is confusing, because life does not organise itself for clarity, and neither does the fiction that takes life seriously as its subject matter. But when you lay it flat, when you take the time to follow the thread from Rick waking up in that hospital to Rick and Michonne driving home through Yellowstone, when you trace Morgan's journey from the house he was clearing in Season 3 all the way to Texas and the found family he built there, when you follow Maggie from the farm to the prison, to the hilltop, to the streets of Manhattan, when you follow Daryl from the woods outside Atlanta to the fields of southern France, the shape of it becomes visible. It is the shape of people who did not stop, who kept going, who kept building, who kept wanting the farmhouse in the field, even when every farmhouse they built was eventually taken or burned or overrun. That is the timeline. That is all of it. There are things we do not know yet. There are threads still being followed. We do not know the full scope of what Rick and Michonne's return home will look like, what Alexandria is now, whether Judith will get to meet her father as the adult she has become while he was gone, what that conversation will sound like. We do not know where Daryl's France arc is ultimately going, whether the European outbreak narrative will connect to the American one in ways that change our understanding of either, whether Laurent's biological distinction will become the foundation for something that changes the franchise's fundamental premise. We do not know what Herschel Jr. is going to choose, whether the path he is walking in. Dead City's second season will take him further from Maggie, or eventually back to her, whether the Dharma's world will make him something his father would recognise, or something entirely different. We do not know what the CRM looks like in the wake of Rick and Michonne's disruption of its command structure, whether the Civic Republic's civilian government can actually hold the military accountable, whether the project of keeping 200,000 people alive is possible without the methods the CRM was using, and if it is possible, what it looks like. We do not know whether there will ever be an answer to the biological question at the centre of the franchise's premise, whether the research that World Beyond helped protect will lead anywhere, whether the French connection to the outbreak's origin means anything actionable, or whether it is simply the franchise's acknowledgement that the outbreak was global from the beginning, and the American perspective was always only one angle on a worldwide event. We do not know how many of the characters we have spent 15 years with will still be alive when the final version of each of these stories is told. We do not know, and neither do they, and this unknowing is the condition they share with each other and with us, the audiences watching them navigate it. The future in this universe is not guaranteed. Tomorrow exists for each character only in the sense that they will make it exist by surviving today, by choosing to keep going, by doing the things that need to be done and then doing the next things. That is not a comfortable way to live. It is not a comfortable story to watch, but it is an honest one. And honesty, in storytelling as in survival, is worth more than comfort in the long run. So, that is the Walking Dead universe, laid out as clearly as it can be laid out, from the first days of the outbreak all the way to the open questions that the franchise is still in the process of answering. It started with a man on a horse riding into a ruined city, looking for his family. It has expanded to cover an entire continent, a corner of Europe, a city of 200,000 people, a flooded island in the middle of New York City, the south of France, the Rocky Mountains, the Yellowstone Basin, the ruins of Philadelphia and Los Angeles and Atlanta. It has given us characters who became important to us in ways that fiction sometimes does, in the way where you think about them when you're not watching them, where their choices feel like they matter. It has also given us 15 years of zombie television, which at its worst is exactly as silly as that sounds, and at its best is something genuinely moving, genuinely human, genuinely worth the time. If you are still awake, I hope the whole shape of it is a little clearer now. If you drifted off somewhere around Atlanta or the hilltop or the south of France, I hope the words carried you somewhere comfortable. Either way, the train keeps going all the way to the end of the line, wherever that turns out to be. Get some rest. The world of The Walking Dead will still be there tomorrow, and so will you. Let us go back to some of the details that the overview necessarily rushed past, because the details are where this universe lives, and sleep content rewards the lingering rather than the rushing. There is something worth sitting with in the very first season of the original show, in the episode where Rick rides into Atlanta on a horse and finds a tank on the street and takes shelter inside it. He is surrounded by walkers. He is, by any reasonable calculation, finished. And then a voice comes over the radio inside the tank. The voice is Glenn Rie. The voice says, in its first words to Rick Grimes, the first words that will eventually define one of the most important relationships in the franchise. Hey you, dumbass. Yeah, you in the tank. Cozy in there? This is how they met. One of them trapped and running out of options, the other watching from a rooftop with the particular clarity of someone who has been surviving this city alone for long enough to have good instincts about when to help and when to run. Glenn helps. He helps because he is Glenn, and because Glenn helps is almost a tautology, a thing that does not need explanation, because the explanation is the person. The friendship between Rick and Glenn across the following seasons is not the show's most dramatic relationship. That would be Rick and Daryl, or Rick and Michonne, or Rick and Negan in its dark mirror way, but it is perhaps the show's most uncomplicated one. Glenn respects Rick's leadership and challenges it when it is wrong, and backs it up when it is right, and is genuinely happy to see Rick in circumstances where happiness is the correct response. Rick treats Glenn as an equal in a group where Glenn might reasonably have expected to be sidelined by people with more obvious force. The relationship between them is built entirely on mutual regard, which in this universe is rare enough to be remarkable. When Glenn dies, Rick is there. He watches. He cannot stop it. He holds the group together in the aftermath through a combination of shock and training, the performance of steadiness in the moment, because someone has to be steady. Later in the RV, he falls apart. The scene where Rick sits on the roof of the RV, holding an axe, crying, not performing grief, but being inside it, is one of Andrew Lincoln's best moments in the show's run. He is not the sheriff's deputy there. He is not the leader. He is a person who just watched someone he cared about be killed and could not do anything about it. And then the next morning, he gets up and does what needs to be done. Because that is what Rick does. That is what all of them do. There is a particular quality to the relationships in this universe that the show has always been most interested in, and that is the quality of being chosen. The families in the Walking Dead universe, almost without exception, are not the families anyone was born into. The bonds that matter are the ones formed after the world ended, forged under conditions where the people involved had every reason to look out only for themselves and chose not to. Rick and Carl and Judith are the show's biological family, and even they, by the later seasons, include Michonne and RJ and Daryl and Carol in a way that is simply not a question. The Grimes family as a unit is whoever showed up and stayed. The Hilltop community under Maggie is a family because Maggie decided it was, because she walked into the Hilltop as a refugee with no official standing and started doing things that needed doing and made herself part of the place before anyone could object. Daryl has no biological family that he is connected to after Merle's death. Merle was his anchor to the world before the outbreak, and also his tormentor, a relationship complicated enough that the show never fully untangled it and probably should not have tried. What Daryl has instead is everyone else. He has Carol, who is the closest thing to a constant that his post-outbreak life has produced. He has the group. He has, in France, a new collection of people who need him and who he finds himself needing in return. Because that is what Daryl does in every season of every show he appears in. He arrives alone, he stays because someone needs him to stay, and then he cannot leave. The found family is not a new concept in fiction. It is perhaps the oldest narrative structure available, the group of strangers who become something more. But The Walking Dead uses it with more genuine grief than most treatments of the idea, because it cannot let the family simply form and exist. It keeps losing members. It keeps requiring the surviving members to absorb that loss and keep going and keep choosing to form the attachment again with whoever is left and whoever has arrived. This is, in some ways, the most realistic thing about the franchise. Real families work this way too. They lose people and they keep going, and they incorporate new people and they lose those people and they keep going. The scale is different. The specific losses in The Walking Dead are more dramatic, more violent, more concentrated in time than most real families experience. But the mechanism is the same. You love someone, you lose someone, you love someone again, because the alternative is to stop. And stopping is not something the living can afford. The geography of the Walking Dead universe is worth spending some time with, because the way the show uses space tells you a great deal about what it thinks survival means at different points in its run. The Atlanta of Season 1 is urban, closed, overwhelming. The streets are full of walkers and the walls of buildings and the abandoned infrastructure of a major city. Rick navigates it with a kind of desperate improvisation, using whatever is at hand, reacting faster than he can plan. The city is the old world turned hostile, all its functions inverted. The tanks that were supposed to protect people, the hospitals that were supposed to heal them, the infrastructure that was supposed to sustain them, all of it now indifferent or actively dangerous. The farm in Season 2 is the opposite. Open, quiet, the horizon visible in every direction. The threat comes from the barn, from the things kept inside a domestic space that should not be there. The farm is the pastoral fantasy of the old world, the American agricultural ideal, and the show uses it as the setting for some of its most domestically painful material, precisely because the fantasy is what makes the reality harder. You want to believe the farm can hold. It cannot. The prison, in Seasons 3 and 4, is the attempt to split the difference between the urban control of Atlanta and the open vulnerability of the farm. Walls, but flexible ones. Structure, but one that the group built themselves. The prison is the most direct articulation of the show's ongoing project of community building, and its eventual fall is the show saying clearly that no physical structure is sufficient protection against the things that threaten survival. The governor with his tank does not fail because the prison walls are strong. He fails temporarily because of human choices. He succeeds, finally, also because of human choices, specifically Lizzie and Mika's arrival with guns that save Tyrese, a sequence that the show acknowledges as almost impossible in its outcome. Alexandria is suburban, which is the choice that carries the most obvious contemporary resonance. The suburb as post-apocalyptic refuge. The homeowners association rules replaced by council decisions. The HOA fences replaced by walls. the lawn care replaced by agricultural necessity. Alexandria is the show's most direct engagement with the American suburban dream and its relationship to security. The idea that if you can just find the right walls and the right neighbours and the right governance structure, the outside world can be managed rather than endured. The sanctuary is industrial, a factory converted, running on labour extracted through debt and fear. The saviours have recreated capitalism, essentially, or a version of it, with Negan as CEO, and the point system as currency, and the labour supply as population. The show is not subtle about this, and it does not need to be. The Commonwealth is the furthest point of this progression, the most complete reconstruction of something that resembles pre-outbreak social organisation. And its problems are the pre-outbreak world's problems: class stratification and corruption, and the distance between the people with power and the people without it. The show's decision to have the main cast reform the Commonwealth rather than destroy it is a political choice, as well as a narrative one. The message is that civilization, with all its failures, is still preferable to its absence, but civilization requires constant work and constant accountability to maintain anything resembling its stated values. From Atlanta to France, from the farm to Philadelphia, the geography expands and the problems become more complex, and the solutions become less about finding the right physical space and more about building the right kinds of relationships between people. The Walking Dead began as a survival story and became, over 15 years, a story about governance, which is perhaps the most adult thing a zombie show has ever decided to be. There are aspects of the Walking Dead universe that reward attention in part because they are never fully explained, and the not fully explaining of them is a choice that reflects something real about how knowledge and mystery coexist in any long-running human community. The nature of the infection is the most significant of these. The show established early, through Jenna's revelation at the CDC, that everyone is already infected. It established that the infection causes reanimation. It has never fully explained what the infection is, where it came from, whether it is a virus or a bacterium or a prion or something that does not have a pre-existing category, whether it was engineered or mutated or arrived from somewhere external, whether there is any conceivable treatment or cure. World Beyond engages most directly with the scientific questions, depicting a research program that has been working on understanding the pathogen for a decade. The French connection established in the post-credits scene suggests that the research has international dimensions, and that whatever knowledge exists about the outbreak's origins may be more accessible in Europe than in America, where the institutions that might have addressed it scientifically were destroyed in the early chaos. The France storyline of Daryl Dixon takes this further by showing a biological variant of the walker, the burners, that suggests the pathogen is not static, that it is evolving or expressing differently in different environments. This is either a very interesting direction for the franchise to explore, or a complication that risks over-explaining a mystery that has been productive, precisely because it has not been explained. The franchise has generally been wisest when it has treated the infection as a condition of existence rather than a puzzle to be solved, because the characters who try to solve it tend to lose sight of the more important questions about how to live within its constraints. The CRM's scientific program, which we see most clearly in World Beyond, is the franchise's most fully developed attempt to address the infection systematically. The resources the CRM has devoted to the research laboratory indicate that solving the outbreak, or at least understanding it, is one of the organisation's genuine objectives, alongside its more immediately brutal ones. Whether the research leads anywhere, whether the scientists protected by World Beyond's finale will make the breakthrough that the CRM was trying to reach through its accumulation of power, is one of the questions the franchise is still holding open. The walker behaviour itself is a persistent area of ambiguity, The show has never been entirely consistent about what walkers can and cannot perceive. They respond to sound primarily. They respond to smell, which is the basis of the camouflage technique of covering yourself in walker blood or wearing walker skins. They seem to respond to movement, or to the absence of the particular quality of movement that the living have. They do not seem to respond to visual detail in the way a living predator would. Alpha and the Whisperers walk among herds in walker skins, and the herds accept them, which suggests that the walker's identification process is less about visual recognition than about a combination of smell and movement pattern that the Whisperers have learned to replicate. The walker behaviour in France is different in ways the show is deliberately building toward. The acidic secretion of the burners is the most visible difference, but there are suggestions of other behavioural variations as well, of walkers that seem to respond to stimuli in ways that the American strain does not. Whether this represents genuine evolution of the pathogen or a different variant that has been present from the beginning but not previously encountered by the American survivors, is the kind of question the franchise has wisely left open. The sorted herds that the Whisperers control raise their own set of questions. Alpha talks about the herd as though she can direct it, and she can, to a degree, using sound and movement to guide the herd's general direction. But the herd is not a weapon in the same sense as a gun or a bomb. It is more like a dam's worth of water, something that can be released and pointed in a general direction, but that is fundamentally a natural force rather than a tool. The show handles this distinction carefully in the season 9 and 10 arcs, using the herd as a source of dread and strategic complication, rather than as something the Whisperers can fully control. There is a conversation in The Ones Who Live, in the episode just before the finale, that summarises something the franchise has been working toward for most of its run. Michonne is talking to Jadis, who is dying, and Jadis is talking about who she was before she was Jadis, before she was a warrant officer of the CRM, before she was an instrument of the organisation's brutal logic. She was Anne. She was a school teacher. She was a painter. She made art in a junkyard community that she organised as a kind of experiment in communal living, an experiment that the show initially presented as eccentric and slightly comic, and that the franchise eventually revealed was Jadis trying to build something genuine in conditions that made genuineness difficult. Anne, the school teacher and painter, died somewhere in the years between the heaps and the CRM, or more precisely, she made a series of decisions that buried Anne under the weight of everything she had to become to survive inside the organisation she had chosen. Jadis knows this. She says so in the conversation. She says she wishes she had died as an artist. This is the franchise in miniature. The person you used to be and the person survival required you to become, and the gap between them that you spend years trying not to look at too directly. Anne wanted to make things. Jadis made decisions. Rick wanted to protect people. The CRM required him to become an instrument of an organisation that destroyed communities as a matter of policy. Maggie wanted to build a life on a farm with the man she loved. The world took the farm and the man and left her with a son and a community to lead and a grief that 12 years has not completed. None of them got what they wanted. What they got instead was what they chose to make of what remained, which is, the franchise argues again and again in its best moments, enough. Not enough to not grieve the difference, not enough to pretend the loss was not real, but enough to keep going, to keep building, to keep being the person who is willing to try. The nights in the Walking Dead universe are the most cinematic part of the franchise's visual language, and they're worth inhabiting for a moment before we finish. The night at the campsite outside Atlanta in Season 1, when the walkers come, is lit by fire and chaos and the specific blue of headlights cutting through darkness. The night at Herschel's farm, when Daryl goes looking for Sophia on a horse and falls into a ravine and is shot by Andrea, who mistakes him for a walker and has to be dragged back to the camp by his own bootlaces, lit by the ambient glow of the surviving farmhouse windows. The night at the prison when Rick's small group first makes their move against the walkers in the yard. Dark and close and dangerous in a way that the daylight confrontations never quite are. The night on the Alexandrian road when Negan appears, with his trucks and his lights, and his saviours stretching back into the darkness. 1,000 points of light that are not comfort but threat. The night in the sanctuary when Rick sees how many people Negan's organisation has and understands, with a physical feeling, the scale of what he is facing. The night at the bridge, the last time we see Rick Grimes for 5 years, standing on the broken railing with the herd below, and the explosion coming, lit by the specific colour of a dawn that he is not going to see the end of. Also, everyone thought, the nights in France that Daryl rides through, medieval roads in darkness with the sound of burners somewhere in the distance, the kind of night that does not provide the reassurance of familiar landmarks, where every shadow could be anything. The night in the Civic Republic parking structure, where Rick and Michonne find each other in the dark, and the only light is whatever light comes through the concrete gaps, which is enough. Night in this universe is not simply the absence of light. It is the condition